So one of the things that I like to do is basically make you do the work of introducing yourselves instead of me reading a bio for you. So when you've been at Cannes, when you're here in the coming days and you meet somebody for the first time, what do you want them to know about you? What do you want their first impression to be of who you are and why you're here?
You want to start?
You go.
You want me to start? I focus on, I'm Nikola, I'm a good person, usually. Because everybody's talking about work, so I try to, focus on my personality. No, I'm kidding. So I'm Nikola, as co-founder and CEO of Under Dynamics. I come from a background in visual effects. I was doing visual effects as a supervisor for many years. And then I started Wonder Dynamics with my friend Ty Sheridan, who's a young actor. Really, we started on kind of because we wanted to, very early, about 2016, we were writing together, and then we wanted to figure out how do we, make sci-fi films cheaper, and then stumbled upon AI very early on, and essentially build a company around speeding up the process of visual effects production in films.
Yeah, so my name's Ben. I usually, lately it seems the topic is AI, and when people, as soon as they see Asteria, it's kind of like, what they associate. But I think mostly like to let people know that I kind of came with a background in kind of more traditional filmmaking, virtual production, and have really kind of saw this wave that was coming and wanted to make sure that there were filmmakers and people that had, real skin in the game as far as, kind of, legacy of participation in the way films have been made, prior to this moment. And so mostly just try to kind of, establish some, common ground that, there are people using AI that aren't, sort of, kind of slop propagators of slop, and that there's real craft, and, there's people that are actually out there trying to, forge a path that we're using this technology that, feels, sort of part of a lineage that, I think we can all feel comfortable with. So, yeah.
Propagators of slop. Love that term. Great band name. How would you describe, because AI is such a broad term and people use it for everything, many things that aren't actually even AI. So how would you explain which aspects of generative artificial intelligence your companies use and specialize in?
Yeah, we're really focused on kind of speeding up the process, specifically around picking up performance. So we started off with, if you know movies like Avatar, you have your mocap suits, right? So we started with something that we essentially made that you don't need any equipment or hardware or motion capture suits to capture performance from an actor, to speed up the process of putting CG characters in films, if you're thinking like Aliens, Robot, etc. And obviously, since then, we've expanded quite a bit, but the focus has always been how do we, make it much easier for people to create content and create movies that were traditionally very focused on only kind of studio budgets, right? If you think especially around CG characters, animation. So, we spent a lot of time focusing on how can we do it with keeping, something being driven, whether it's an actor or a cinematographer. So we really always take information. We're not generating as much as more accelerating the process.
Yeah, I think for us, the way that we think about it is at its kind of most basic form is a very sophisticated render engine, right? Like an augmentation engine. So rather than, for us, it's very rarely about, creating material wholesale from AI. We almost always, in every project we do, we're hiring, concept artists and, art directors, production designers. We, focus a lot on animation initially, and so we're hiring animators, designing motion and performance, and using human actors and cameras and performance to sort of ground and create a substrate, and then, using AI to sort of do the aspects of it that get more technical, where you'd normally be into Houdini or the really sophisticated, which create, a barrier, I think, when you're talking about, lacking access to high-end visual effects, pipelines and teams of that scale. And so it's really about sort of kind of, again, grounding it in that traditional, kind of human authorship, but then using it to sort of elevate what's possible, elevate the production value of those things so that you can create, science fiction films or period films or all these things that are sort of normally the domain of sort of studio, pictures. So
that seems to be one of the recurring themes this week is grounding the use of AI in how human labor intensive it is, like how much work this still actually is to use these tools, because it's not like, you know, what you can do at home in 30 seconds on your phone. It's a totally different technology and interface and many different versions of tools. And so can you just sort of walk me through the human creativity elements and how you balance keeping that, you touched on this a little bit, with the use of the tools to keep it truly human art, but one that is more efficient and doing things that wouldn't have been possible either budgetarily or, you know, gravitationally because of limits prior to the existence of these kinds of tools?
Yeah, no, I think there's this misconception. First, as you said, people are bucketing the whole AI together, right? It's a very, very wide field. And we'll be using AI in film for decades, just not at this scale yet, and it hasn't been this accessible. I think for us, well, we're a little bit different because, you know, we started a company. My co-founder's an actor, so of course we're not going to replace actors in our process. You know, that was one of the main things. And you know, I think early on we had backing from Spielberg and Russo brothers, so we really worked closely, especially with the Russo brothers, on how do we really worked with artists to realize what data do you need to come quicker to your final shot. Because we saw early on that there's this overpromise of AI as a one-click solution, right? That's just going to prompt your movie away. I'm a big believer that you cannot prompt, you know, your shots away. It's especially if you think about timing, pacing, you know, understanding the camera, understanding composition. And I'm a big believer that really performances cannot really be written, right? If you look at acting in general, that's why we take multiple takes, right, in a shot, because you cannot describe someone's emotion or reaction. It's really hard to describe that in words, right? So I think that's really, really important. So for us, it's always been, how do I, you know, early on we saw that AI is going to get us about 60, 70% there of a shot, much quicker. But then you become a black box, you know, especially if you're prompting it completely. So we really focus on, like, how do I add it to existing pipeline? How do I accelerate the existing pipeline on that way? So I think that's one thing, but I think also, you know, something I say a lot is we have this belief that it's going to be much easier to make films, which it is, but I think the people tend to make conclusion as we're going to stop there. Like, if something's easy, we're just going to stop and everybody's going to go and watch film that took a week to make. I mean, it's not going to happen, because we like art because it's very difficult to make art, right? So we just don't know what that next step is of difficulty, right? But we're always going to add that human element, you know. When you're just kind of raising the floor, right, and raising the ceiling, and so the starting point is very different.
Yeah, and I think that, like, part of the challenge right now with the narrative around it, and, you know, as a sort of this catch-all term, is that a lot of the most vocal proponents of it are coming from, you know, are very, like, kind of like new entrants into filmmaking, or the, you know, kind of like AI native kind of. You know, and there's all these, you know, Hollywood is cooked, R.I.P. Hollywood, kind of, you know, that's been years, right? Yeah. And no one's made even, I think, a very compelling short film, you know, that, you know, would screen at, you know, to the caliber of films that screen here. And so I think part of it, and then there's also been a trepidation by a lot of the filmmaking community to, you know, explore the technology. So now I think as you see more, you know, kind of filmmakers that have, you know, honed their crafts. You know, I'm privileged to work with some of them. Paul here is a, you know, a fantastic filmmaker who, you know, I think really has hybridized the way, you know, filmmaking can be perceived with this technology. And so I think it's about finding the voices that, you know, are using it. I would think more responsibly and more, you know, coming from a motivated by art, not just the ease of the process of creation. And so, you know, we try to always, you know, balance, you know, kind of the over-promising of what AI is going to do with, like, you know, and we're always very transparent about our process because of that. We want people to see that, like, you know, AI only, you know, informs a part of that process rather than sort of overwhelming or dominating the whole, you know, the whole film.
Yeah, I think because we're the problem I see, at least in our industry, is that in nature, the AI technology is being driven by a lot of startups that are not making it for Hollywood. They're making technology for video creation, which is social media. because that's where most of the money is. So as a startup, when you raise money from venture capitalists, usually you have to explain to them what's the size of your market, right? Hollywood's not that big of a market from a tech standpoint, right? So a lot of these startups are focusing on social media, video creation, and that's really where the danger is. That's where you see those prompting and the slop, as you mentioned, et cetera. So that's what we see a lot in the news. So we're relating that. That's where the titles Hollywood is Cook come up. But fundamentally, our approach to filmmaking is very different, because I think we're, especially in the generative, like let's call last 4 or 5 years, really is all about being generative, right? How do I generate something? Now everybody's realizing, how do I edit? Because once I generate, I can. And then we make kind of full circle and realize, okay, I cannot really edit performance without an actor fully. I can't edit a camera in 3D space without being in a 3D space, etc. So we're seeing a lot of these research and a lot of these companies learn about filmmaking. But I do think it's very important for us as an industry to develop and have, companies like Asteria and others where you can really, build the ground up by understanding who you're building it for. That's really that's a big conflict I'm seeing. It's a different use case, and unfortunately, one is much louder, and it's more research and more funds are being put in that direction.
And I think that what's cool, I think we probably have both similar experiences from what you guys now at Autodesk and, kind of work we did last year partnering with Moon Valley, an ML kind of research company. Sort of how do we create an interface with, some of these like titans of, technology that, don't, Autodesk obviously has a much more, long-standing pedigree with, filmmaking community, but, ML companies, particularly, big tech, you saw some of the early clashes with the filmmaking community because they were sort of coming in with a bulldozer. And so I think there's about partnering and embedding with those and embedding, filmmakers in those institutions to sort of shepherd the usage of the technology and guide it in a way and inform it. And that's a lot of what the work that we do is really trying to steer it. You don't necessarily need it, for high-end filmmaking, you don't need it to be a fully generative prompt interface. In many cases, you only need it to do certain, subsets of that to sort of achieve, hopefully a better result. So that's kind of the way that we've been thinking about it.
I have to imagine, too, that there are a lot of times where there's a bit of a disconnect when you're coming from the tech background, creating tools just, to see what is possible versus coming from the filmmaking side and what would be useful. Like finding out, okay, well, where are there steps in your process, either something that is physically impossible or financially impossible or too time intensive, that we could potentially create a tool to solve that problem for you. And I'm curious what impossible things you've been able to do using AI tools on projects you've worked on.
I mean, for us, it started really early. As I said, we started a company about 2016. So even in the early days, we were getting, feedback from people, hey, we have a company of 5 to 7 people. We were never able to do something, especially around if you're going to have, characters that don't exist in the real world, because that was our focus. Like, we don't, to me, it's not interesting to have synthetic actors being, populating your films. So for us, it was more like, how do you create something where you can put robots or aliens or something in a shot? So I think for us, we've seen a lot of different genres tackling it as well, and then a lot of smaller teams. I think that's really the most exciting part is you have a smaller team, you have a lower budget, and then you can compete. Because we really started this, me and my co-founder, because we were writing films together, and then we realized, we wrote sci-fi with robots to make it more meta. And we realized early on, there's no way we need $100 million for this. As first-time directors, good luck getting that funded, right? So I think, we were kind of looking at the Blumhouse model. We were not planning to make technology. We wanted to do a sci-fi production company that's like a Blumhouse model, but just specifically for sci-fi and animation. And then we started looking in kind of self-driving car and computer vision and some robotics technology. We call it visual AI at the time. There was no term generative AI. So we were the first example of like, how do you make something that you couldn't really afford before? And I think that's the excitement of AI. We were expanding the reach of how many people can tell their stories. That's why I got into space. I always thought our industry, unfortunately, is quite gate-kept, and it's really, really hard to get. I mean, now, arguably, it's harder to get your indie film funded, harder than ever, which is, it's kind of the irony of AI being disruptor at the same time and, being extremely difficult to make films. Unfortunately, our industry suffer, but I think the technology shift is needed because production is way too expensive. It's not a sustainable business, right? I always try to, when I go to new places, I try to look infrastructure in the building, and you look at something, you're like, this hospital costed 20 million, so this movie costed like 5 of those hospitals, right? So it's to me, it's always fascinating that that's the case, right? In our industry, we just got used to it. We think it's normal for a film to cost $200 million. That is not normal. It should not be like that. So I think that's where the good side of AI is coming. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of struggle and disruption in a way, but I think I'm an optimist long term.
Yeah, I mean, I always hesitate to say like that we're doing things that couldn't be done. Like, if you go up to ILM, those guys, can do anything. They can, but at what cost, right? And to your point, and that's why it's a gate-kept industry, because to really hit that, takes, that level of resourcing and that, I think for us, the areas that we found have been interesting, particularly in animation, though, are, and to borrow a term from one of my colleagues, is, scaling aesthetics, which is, what are the kind of types of animation that historically would be impossible to do, whether it's making things look like, oil paintings. We did a project where we, had an artist, who had a very distinct, like, stippled ink style that, for that to be animated would have been, immensely prohibitive. Not just that, but like the animators themselves were like, please don't make us animate all these dots, So there's things that, like, I think we're also looking at how we can, so again, it's not that it would have been impossible, but it certainly, I think it removed a barrier for us to, whether it was, kind of a more, kind of a morale barrier, or, a financial resourcing barrier that allowed us to sort of engage and push into these new aesthetics. And so I think that's I think what's very exciting as well, is like, what can we do not just to replicate or emulate like what has existed prior, but how can we define new visual aesthetics and kind of explore new domains? And I think that's kind of like, what's exciting about this, and hopefully I think people, as they look at the technology, are thinking, as we saw with Pixar, is like, how do we invent new languages and kind of invent new, kind of visual aesthetics, and explore, kind of new types of filmmaking. So yeah, that's kind of how we view it.
A lot of the conversation is around animation, because that's been where a lot of the experimentation that has become public has gone, because obviously this is something that a lot of people have been playing with behind the scenes quietly for years, and the conversations are just now starting to really happen more out in the open. But I'm curious, I've heard some things about nonfiction. There's the Harlan Coben doc that Dave Clark mentioned at the AI Summit across the street, that they used the tools to recreate crime scenes from like decades ago based on photos. And then Darren Aronofsky said that they had a project that involved a newborn baby, and it's like there are deeply ethical issues with bringing a newborn baby to set. This allowed us to turn whatever the actress was holding into a baby without having to actually have a newborn child on set. And those were two instances where I had never thought of that as an application for these kinds of tools, but it makes sense. And I'm curious, where else you see possibilities for, like, are there any genres or types of scenes or other, specific details that might not be immediately obvious where you think that these kinds of tools could be useful?
Yeah, I think what we've seen, used, the kind of people that are using our tool is, I've seen a lot of traditionally genres that stayed away from CG, that tried using it. Sometimes it's even, kind of serial television on weekly level, because you can't really, if you're releasing something every week, like silly things like Masked Singer, using things to generate a character on the street. That's a silly example, but I think what we've seen is more of how do you really allow. I think what we're doing is we're seeing a shift a little bit. Like traditionally, indie filmmaking stayed away from visual effects. Like if you had green screen, you couldn't afford it. Like back in the day, even roto was so expensive, you couldn't really afford it. So you stayed away from, you wrote your script in a way like, I cannot go this direction. I have to stay in this box in a way, right, on it. So I think that's what I'm seeing more, is that you're seeing more kind of indie filmmakers, especially around sci-fi and animation, because they lends itself naturally to it. Animation lends itself naturally because a lot of research is around solving problems there in animation. And I always say a lot of it is also because a lot of this may sound weird, but myself included, a lot of artists are a bit myself. I'm a loner when I'm working in certain things, and just being able to do it by yourself, on a computer, tends to like lead towards the research that's like how do I achieve more things as one person, right? In a way. So I think that's why we're seeing a lot of these genres naturally lean into it. But to me, the most exciting part is that you're seeing that shift of, being able to make bigger risks. I think that's what we're seeing as well. Because if you're cutting down the cost of production and visual effects, I think if you look at the studio films, it's not like studio. People always say like, oh, studios don't have new ideas. No, they have a lot of new ideas. They just cannot risk it. Because when you make something for 200 million, you have to put about 500 million right in it to break even, right? So you cannot really risk it. You have to have an audience from a 9-year-old to a 50-year-old to watch your film. So you can't go make, an art film set in space. You just can't, right? Like back in the day, we could. If you think about 2001, Space Odyssey is something we couldn't have make today. If people say it's too slow, nobody's going to watch it, etc. Right? So I think that's where I'm excited about. I think a lot of filmmakers will be able to make bigger risks because the cost is coming down, and so that way, like visually, I think visually you don't have to kind of sacrifice your script, because every time you're creating and you're writing something, I don't know about you, but my process is always when I write something, the first thing you write, you don't think about limitations, and then you start it and you realize, well, I can't even go this genre because I can never make this genre, right? So that's really exciting for me about the tools.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we do everything from animation to kind of pursuing, kind of more high, concept VFX type driven work. But on our pedigree is also, comes a lot from documentary filmmaking. We're finding a lot of really interesting happenings that, are elevating what's possible in that medium. Especially, when you think about things that deal with the past and archival, there's, limitations, recreations tend to historically be, kind of panned because they just look, tend to look cheap because of documentaries are not the most well-funded, obviously. But we've been working on a couple of projects where we're, whether it's taking, photographs or even, we're doing a project that's set in sort of the age of antiquity and, recreating, temples that no longer exist and rituals that no longer exist. And I think there's something that kind of you can connect with the past more readily when it sort of feels like it's part of the cinematic language. And I think there's something that, changes it from viewing something more like, through just a lens of, documentation and something that actually evokes, feelings. And obviously you have responsibilities around how much you editorialize those things in documentary. But I think there's something that really can, really immerse you in those stories in ways that, we're finding, documentary filmmakers are really excited about. So that's something that I think, is probably on the lesser thought of, but certainly something that I think maybe opens that whole genre up in a big way in the near future.
All right, well, we're almost up on time, but I want to know what do you have in the pipeline that makes you excited to come to work in the morning?
Which morning? Every morning?
Every morning.
Not this morning. I made a mistake. I agreed to 11 a.m. panel in Cannes. This is my first time in Cannes. I didn't know better. I came in last night. Told my friend I agreed to 11 a.m. He's like, that's a mistake. It's like, you've never been to Cannes. You never book things before lunch. Sorry. I really low. Yeah.
I'm deeply offended.
Yeah, I'm sorry. No, happy to be here. We do have few releases coming out. I think you mentioned earlier, one of the things that we've been always focused on, especially with visual effects and CG, there's quite a bit of big bottleneck of skill set needed. These softwares are traditionally, they've been worked on for decades, right? Traditional kind of computer graphics software and visual effects, they are difficult to learn. So for us, it's all, this year we have something coming out that I'm very excited about because it's lowering the barrier of that bottleneck, but it's also solving the problem, which I'm seeing in generative AI. One of the biggest problems is editability to the finest detail. And that's, when you work with the directors, you're going to realize, they like their camera to an inch. They like the timing and pace of performance. That's what generative AI is not good at yet. But that's the limitations of prompting something, right? Because it's very hard to time a shot just by describing it. And by performance, you want, this second you want to look at this way. Like you want to control it to the finest detail, right? So that's something we've been working on for years, and we're launching this year. So I'm really excited. It's been a mission from the day one. So we're building slowly to it.
Yeah, a few things. I mean, there's a few projects that we probably can't share, but are with incredible filmmakers and will be kind of coming out in the next couple of months. So that's very exciting for us because it's a chance to I think showcase all the incredible work. We do a lot of work with studios and but it's hush hush and sort of kept in the dark corners of the laboratory. But I think to actually get those experiments out into the world is very exciting for us because I think when we do that, we also show a lot of the process that we did that, and I think it tends to invite more and more filmmakers into the use of the technology. And we're also developing similarly like a lot of tools that I think address that same point, editability and customization. We're big into that. We're also developing a product that's part of a product suite called Continuum, which even touches pre-production, script analysis, budgeting, kind of how you can make productions more efficient. For it's a way to use generative AI in a way that maybe people who aren't used to using generative AI or make it feel a bit invisible. It's not about making an image; it's about making a smarter production. And so we're trying to kind of find other ways to deploy agents and things like that, and kind of make production smarter. There's a lot, I think, of inefficiency that happens just because of the nature of our kind of barbaric ways that we're still running around with paper and spreadsheets and stuff like that. How can we make that how we can modernize production as well is very exciting. So
awesome. Well, thank you, Ben. Thanks, Nikola. And thank you all for coming. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday in Cannes.
Thank you. Thanks.